I was born in Pretoria, which is the capital city of South Africa, so I've never doubted that I was a South African. However, a few years ago, that certainty wavered. I was looking at a copy of my birth certificate when I noticed that the citizenship designated to me was not South African. I remember calling my dad and exclaiming, Dad, I'm not South African. And he responded, "What are you talking about? Of course you are." I proceeded to explain to him that my birth certificate listed the city of my birth as Pretoria, but it gave me citizenship of Bophuthatswana. "Wow," he replied. He and my mom had never picked that up. After a few inquiries to the Department of Home Affairs, I was issued with another certificate that stated my citizenship as South African. Bophuthatswana was one of the several homelands created within South Africa by the apartheid government as a place that black people were to live in according to their tribes. It was one of the products of the over 150 codified laws that were intricately and interwoven for the sole purpose to separate non-white South Africans from black South Africans, or rather from white South Africans, in all areas of life. Black South Africans were dispossessed of their land, homes, and livelihoods, and forcibly relocated to designated underdeveloped areas. Many were stripped of their South African citizenship. There was a season in my dad's life when his passport described him as stateless. Our only crime being black. By laws, black South Africans were prohibited from using the same transportation and health systems and from enjoying the same public amenities as white South Africans. We were denied the right to vote. We were forbidden from marrying someone of a different race. Not only could we not attend the same schools as white South Africans, the education system afforded to us was deliberately of a lower standard, underscoring the belief on which apartheid was premised. Black people were morally and racially inferior to white people, and so had to be separated from them on all levels of society and treated as second-class citizens. That was apartheid. That is not what Israel is. I often find myself in a comical state of disbelief and awe that Israel continues to be labeled as an apartheid state. I'm going to leave it in the interest of time to Yosef to describe Israeli life, but I will say this. The diversity of Israeli politics, policies, culture, and overall Israeli life is incomparable to apartheid South Africa. Because Israel haters are determined that Israel be accused of being an apartheid state and so be guilty of committing a crime against humanity, a new definition of apartheid is now being advanced by non-governmental organizations and authors to perpetuate this decades-old lie conceived by Soviet and Arab propaganda machinery. The disassociation of apartheid from the South African experience, which frankly is the genesis of apartheid, and imposition on Israel of the intent to commit apartheid is troubling for many reasons. It trivializes the humiliation and injustices endured by black South Africans who lived through apartheid and who still, together with their descendants, bear their scars of its legacy. I'm of the opinion that it goes further. I believe it erases the very real, very lived experiences of the brutality of apartheid, a reality that includes mothers who to this day do not know what happened to their children, and millions of black South Africans who had to flee their country and live in exile under fear of persecution purely because of the color of their skin. My people's history and our experience is being used as an anti-Semitic tool to politically, morally, and with the most incredible pretzel-like twisting and legal gymnastics that I have seen, legally delegitimize Israel with a hope to criminalize her. Israel critics who use the false apartheid claim often cite black Africans who hold or held similar views. They say things like, well, Bishop Desmond Tutu said that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians is apartheid. It is true that the late Bishop Tutu said these things. It is also true that South Africa's ruling party, the African National Congress, has in recent years adopted an increasingly antagonistic stance towards the Jewish state. But South Africans are not a monolith. From faith leaders to politicians, business personnel to community leaders, many have called out and do call out this lie. In his address at the 37th Congress of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, Nelson Mandela said, "We, referencing the African National Congress, recognize the legitimacy of Palestinian nationalism just as we recognize the legitimacy of Zionism as Jewish nationalism. We insist on the right of the State of Israel to exist within secure borders, but with equal vigor support the Palestinian right to self-determination. King Goodwill Zwelithini, the late king of South Africa's largest tribe and ethnic group, the Zulus, retired Chief Justice of South Africa's Constitutional Court, Chief Justice Mogoeng, South African parliamentary member and leader of one of the opposition parties in South Africa's government, Reverend Dr. Kenneth Mishoe, Bishop Dr. Barnabas Lechanyana, leader of the Zionist Christian Church, the largest African-initiated church in Southern Africa, are names that you may not have heard before. But these are names of South African leaders who do not equate support for the Palestinian people as having to be anti-Israel. They are leaders who publicly debunk the labeling of apartheid against Israel, who see the importance of a strong South Africa relationship for the benefit of all South Africans and all Africans. On 21 June 2004, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan noted that the United Nations emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust, and that a human rights agenda that fails to address anti-Semitism denies its own history. He also said that the fight against anti-Semitism must be the United Nations fight, and that the Jews everywhere should feel that the United Nations is their home too. It thus boggles the mind why the United Nations Human Rights Council would establish a commission inquiry that is anti-Semitic, that stretches indefinitely into the future and into the past, that is one-sided, and is chaired by someone who has made no secret her anti-Israel bias. The weaponization of apartheid by the United Nations and now the Commission of Inquiry makes a mockery of what the United Nations was mandated and is mandated to do, and that is enhance international cooperation for the promotion and protection of all human rights. The continued misuse of apartheid makes peace for Israelis and Palestinians unattainable because it creates a barrier from holding Hamas and the Palestinian Authority accountable for their mistreatment of the Palestinian people. It attacks, as well as attacks against Israelis, be they Jewish, Arab, Druze, and Christian, and because it prevents the truth. There can be no justice without truth. The apartheid narrative also has implications for a region whose significance in this conversation cannot be ignored, and that is Africa. In 2021, Israel was rightfully awarded observer status at the African Union. Arab leaders have led the protest in denouncing this move. Surprise, surprise. Oh, the hypocrisy that the Palestinian Authority should enjoy observer status, but a country that has done much good for African nations and the African people should be denied this same privilege. When members of the African Union gathered earlier this year to vote whether to retain or remove Israel's observer status, Moussa Faki Mahamat, chairperson of the African Union Commission, noted that 44 of the 55 countries that comprise Africa recognize Israel and have established diplomatic relations with the state. Many African states have opened their markets and economic space to Israeli enterprises and have signed cooperation agreements in fields including, but not limited to, education, defense, security, intelligence, nuclear cooperation, agriculture, technological innovations, health, economy, and finance. It is thus a mystifying situation that this reality is not reflected by African nations at the United Nations. The apartheid lie is instead brandished against the strengthening of ties by African nations with Israel. African nations are expected to, and have indeed made peace and forged close ties with nations that colonized us, that enslaved our people, and that slaughtered us like animals. Israel, who we are told to shun, has committed no such atrocities. As a proud daughter of the African continent, I respectfully ask African leaders, how has lending support for hatred against the Jewish people progressed the needs of the continent? We have propped up the morally and legally corrupt notions that Israel is guilty of apartheid, colonization, and genocide. To what benefit? Africa is now the global eye of terrorism, and slavery is rampant in no less than 5 African countries, some of which have already had a seat and do have a seat on the Human Rights Council. Our support for the Palestinian people should be lent where it will change the status quo. demanding their liberation from Hamas and Palestinian leadership that denies them basic and fundamental human rights. We have for far too long lent our name, lent our history, lent our votes to the centrality of a program that seeks to demonize and isolate the Jewish state, more so than it seeks to improve the lives of the Palestinian people. It is time for Africa to reassume her rightful place as a leader in relations with Israel, just as she did 3,000 years ago by way of Queen Sheba, who visited King Solomon in Jerusalem. As was evidenced at the dawn of many African democracies in the 1950s and 1960s, close relations with Israel has real and meaningful economic, health, food security, counterterrorism, and many other benefits for the African people. I would have never thought that I would ever quote Elvis Presley, but allow me to do so as I close. There's a first time for everything. Elvis said, "Truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a time, but it ain't going away." Here is to continuing to work towards the day when the light of truth will shine through the corridors of the United Nations and illuminate all its chambers. The truth that, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Israel is one of the great outposts of democracy in the world and a marvelous example of what can be done, how desert land can be transformed into an oasis of brotherhood and democracy.
We're not going to take questions from the audience, but we will.